The trip started out as a much-needed escape. Work had been dragging me down for months, and I couldn't take the monotony of waking up every day just to stare at a computer screen for hours on end. So, when I finally got a long weekend, I decided to go solo camping in the national forest about 3 hours from home. It wasn't my first time camping alone. I've always found something calming about the isolation of it, the simplicity of life in the woods, away from the constant noise of the city. No texts, no emails, just quiet. I packed light but made sure I had everything essential. My tent, sleeping bag, food for a couple of days, my trusty camping stove, a water filter, and a small first aid kit. My knife and a small hatchet were in the side pocket of my backpack, and I carried a headlamp with extra batteries. I left early Friday morning, hoping to get to my campsite before noon. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a light breeze, not too hot. The drive up was uneventful, the roads mostly empty, and by the time I turned off the main highway onto the gravel road that led into the woods, I was already feeling more relaxed. The forest was dense, with tall pines stretching endlessly in every direction. The road narrowed as I drove deeper in, the trees pressing close on either side. My campsite was about 2 miles from the trailhead, near a small lake. It wasn't an official campground, but I'd found it a year ago on another trip. Back then, it had been perfect, quiet, secluded, with a flat spot for my tent and easy access to the water. I parked my car at the trailhead, shouldered my pack, and started hiking. The trail was familiar, winding gently uphill through the trees. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was high overhead. I set up my tent in the same spot as before, on a flat patch of ground a few yards from the lake. The water sparkled in the sunlight, and I could already feel the tension draining from my body. After setting up camp, I sat on a rock by the lake, eating a sandwich and watching the water. There was no one else around, just me, the trees, and the occasional bird. The afternoon passed quickly. I spent some time gathering firewood, then walked down to the lake and filtered some water to refill my bottles. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I built a small fire and cooked dinner. A simple meal of instant noodles and canned tuna. Not gourmet, but it tasted damn good after a day of hiking and setting up camp. By the time the sky turned pink and orange, I was feeling content and a little drowsy. The woods around me were peaceful, the air cool and still. Then I heard it, a soft sound, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, a rustling in the bushes behind me. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a raccoon or a deer maybe, but something about it made me uneasy. It wasn't the random rustling of an animal moving through the underbrush. It was deliberate, slow. I turned, peering into the shadows. The firelight didn't reach far, and beyond its circle of warmth, the forest was dark. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The hair on the back of my neck standing up, a sudden tightness in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I added more wood to the fire, the flames flaring up, casting flickering shadows across the trees. I sat there for a while, staring into the darkness, listening. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was being paranoid. The woods are full of noises, especially at night. I'd spent enough time camping to know that. Still, I kept my knife within reach as I climbed into my tent and zipped it shut. The forest was quiet now, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the shore. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the tent's ceiling, my ears straining for any hint of movement. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I knew, I was wide awake, heart pounding with no idea why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow through the tent walls. The forest was pitch black, the air cold and still. I lay there, holding my breath, listening, and then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not the light, quick steps of an animal, but slow, deliberate footsteps. They were close, too close. My mind raced. It had to be another camper, someone who had stumbled onto my sight by accident. But it was the middle of the night, and I hadn't seen another soul all day. I reached for my knife, my hand trembling. The footsteps stopped, just outside the tent. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast in the silence. I gripped the knife tighter, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Then the tent zipper started to move. Slowly, I froze. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The zipper stopped halfway down, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then a hand reached inside. It was dark, but I could see the outline of it. A pale hand, the fingers long and thin. It fumbled for a moment, then grabbed the edge of the tent and pulled it open wider. I reacted without thinking. I lashed out with the knife, the blade slicing through the air. The hand jerked back, and there was a sharp cry, a man's voice, filled with pain and surprise. I scrambled out of the tent, the knife still in my hand. My eyes darted around, searching for whoever or whatever had been there, but there was no one, just the dark woods and the faint echo of footsteps retreating into the trees. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was he? What did he want? I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my pack, threw it over my shoulder, and started running back toward the trailhead. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming like silent sentinels. Every rustle, every crack of a branch made me flinch, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The trail was harder to follow in the dark, but I didn't dare stop. I kept moving, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the faint outline of my car through the trees. Relief washed over me, but I didn't slow down until I was inside, the doors locked, the engine roaring to life. I drove away without looking back, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight they ached. My mind was still racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, the lights of a gas station glowing like a beacon in the distance. I pulled in, parked under the bright lights, and sat there for a long time, trying to calm my breathing. It wasn't until I saw the blood on my knife, the thin smear of red along the blade, that it really sank in. Whoever he was, I'd hurt him. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. I called the local rangers the next morning and reported the incident, but they didn't find anyone. No tracks, no blood, nothing. I haven't been back to that campsite since. Maybe it was just some crazy guy, someone looking for trouble. Or maybe it was something worse. Either way, I'm done with solo camping. Some things just aren't worth the risk. It was just supposed to be a quiet hike. Something simple. A few hours in the woods. A chance to clear my mind and stretch my legs. I've done it 100 times before. Picked a trail, grabbed my gear, and walked into the trees, just me and the world. No company needed, no distractions. I love the outdoors, the peace it gives me. But this time, things didn't go as planned. This time, I didn't come back the same. It was late September when I decided to take the trail that day. I remember because of the chill in the air, the kind of crispness that only comes with autumn creeping in. The leaves were changing, patches of orange, yellow, and red scattered across the trees. I thought it'd be the perfect time for a quiet walk, so I grabbed my pack and set off early. The trail I picked was one I'd done before, a route that wound through the woods, following the edge of a creek before slowly ascending up a hillside. Nothing too difficult, nothing too far. Just a nice, peaceful walk, or so I thought. The trailhead was just off a small country road, and I pulled my car into the lot, locking it behind me. I was alone, but that didn't bother me. I preferred it that way. At first, everything was fine. The crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the smell of wet earth in the air, the soft babble of the creek as I crossed it. It all felt normal, comfortable, the kind of peaceful solitude I'd been craving. I'd been walking for about an hour when I noticed something off. It wasn't much, just a slight feeling that I wasn't alone. I shook it off, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It happens sometimes when you're alone in the woods. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches above me, and the sound of birds chirping had quieted down. I noticed that the trail had started to get steeper, but I wasn't worried. It wasn't a difficult climb, just a steady incline. But the farther I went, the more I felt it, like someone was watching me. At first, it was easy to dismiss. The sound of sticks snapping in the distance, the rustling of leaves. But after a while, it became hard to ignore. I began to speed up, hoping that the feeling would pass. But the feeling didn't go away. It stayed, hanging in the air, weighing on me like a heavy cloud. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. I was just being paranoid. There's no one out here, I thought. The trail was remote after all. People didn't come out here often. I was too far into the woods for anyone else to be around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, about 2 hours into the hike, I noticed something strange. I had crossed a small bridge over a stream, and as I looked around, I saw what I thought was a figure moving through the trees. It was quick, too quick for me to make out details, but I definitely saw it. It wasn't an animal. It was human-shaped. I froze, heart pounding. I waited for a few seconds, listening for any sound, any movement. But there was nothing, just the wind in the trees. I stepped forward cautiously, trying to stay quiet, but the noise of my boots on the rocks and dirt made me feel like I was walking on glass. After what felt like forever, I decided it was nothing. My mind was just playing tricks on me, probably an animal or a shadow from the trees. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down, and continued up the trail. The trees began to thin out, and I found myself standing on the edge of a small clearing. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the ground. It was getting late, but I wasn't worried. The trail looped back toward the car from here. I just had to keep going for a little while longer. But then I heard something. It was soft, distant at first. A voice, barely audible, but definitely a voice. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear. It sounded like a man, calling out, just one word over and over. "Hey!" I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one. The clearing was empty, just the trees and the sound of wind. I didn't see anyone, but that voice, it wasn't my imagination. I was sure of it. I stood there for a few moments trying to calm my breathing. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I'd been out here too long. But no, this felt different. It was too real to ignore. I didn't know what to do. Should I go toward the voice? Should I keep moving on the trail? My instincts told me to turn back, to leave this area and not look back. But I couldn't shake the thought. What if someone was out there, hurt, needing help? After a moment's hesitation, I chose to move forward. I had to know. I couldn't just ignore it. I walked toward the source of the voice, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The clearing was narrow, only about 20 yards wide. The voice was getting louder, more insistent now, calling, "Hey!" over and over. But still, I couldn't see anyone. Then, I reached the other side of the clearing, and my foot caught on something. A root or maybe a rock. I stumbled, but caught myself, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just behind a large rock, I noticed a shape. Something dark, something out of place. I didn't move for a moment, just stared at it. The voice stopped. No more "hey," no sound at all. My heart thudded in my chest as I took a step closer. And then I saw what it was. It was a backpack. A hiking backpack, dark green, lying on the ground near a small cluster of trees. There was no one around, but the pack was definitely there, untouched. A rush of unease filled me. Why was it here, alone? It didn't make sense. I looked around, but there were no other signs of a person. No trail of footsteps, no broken branches. It was as if whoever owned the pack had just vanished. I stepped closer, but before I could reach it, I froze. There was something else. Something in the trees, just beyond the clearing. A flash of movement. Someone or something was watching me. I felt my stomach drop. I wasn't alone. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. I turned on my heel and started walking fast, then running. The trail was further ahead, and the thought of getting back to the safety of the marked path was the only thing on my mind. But as I ran, I heard something behind me. Footsteps. Not my own, but someone else's. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The path was getting steeper now, the trail more difficult to follow. The light was fading, and I could barely see. But I didn't care. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with the effort. When I reached the point where the trail looped back toward the parking lot, I stopped. I dared to glance behind me, half expecting to see someone or something coming after me. But there was nothing. The woods were silent, empty. I felt a rush of relief. It was over. I wasn't being followed. But that didn't mean I was safe. I hiked the last stretch of the trail as quickly as I could, my heart still pounding. The trees around me began to thin, and soon, I saw the parking lot up ahead. I burst out of the woods, breathless, and didn't stop until I reached my car. I locked the door behind me and sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel. What had just happened? Who left the pack behind? Was someone else out there, lost? Or was it something else entirely? I don't know. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going back on that trail again. I started the engine and drove home, the silence in the car almost as unnerving as the woods had been. But I didn't care. I was safe now. I've always thought of myself as someone who enjoys solitude, a break from the noise of the world, just me and my thoughts. So when I found that small cabin in the woods for rent, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to get away, clear my head, and enjoy a few days in peace. I wasn't expecting much, just a small, secluded place to escape to. But as soon as I arrived, I felt something strange, an uneasy feeling I couldn't quite shake off. The cabin itself wasn't much. It sat in the middle of a dense forest, miles away from any neighbors or main roads. The gravel driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the wood of the cabin had the dull, grayish hue of age and neglect. I wasn't worried, though. I was there for some quiet time, not to inspect the place. I pulled my car to the front and killed the engine. The silence was the first thing that struck me. No birds, no breeze, nothing. Just stillness. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and walked up to the door. It creaked as I opened it, the hinges dry from years of disuse. Inside, the cabin was exactly what I expected, basic, sparsely furnished. A couch, a small kitchen, a single bed tucked in the corner with a thin quilt. There were a few shelves with some old books and a fireplace against one wall. The air was musty, thick with the smell of wood and dust. The windows were covered with heavy, dark curtains that blocked out any light from the outside. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't cozy either. I threw my bag down onto the bed and started exploring the place, looking for any signs of life or death. There was a small bathroom, a single mirror above the sink, a few towels hanging on a hook. The whole place seemed untouched, as if no one had been there for years. The quiet was almost oppressive. After a while, I decided to step outside and get some fresh air. I needed a break from the stifling atmosphere inside. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the forest. The trees around the cabin were so thick that only a sliver of sky peeked through the gaps. I walked a little ways into the woods, just enough to stretch my legs. The quiet was even more intense out there, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to push the unease out of my mind. I had rented this place because I wanted to get away from the distractions of everyday life. The fact that it was so remote, so empty, was supposed to be a selling point. But as I walked further, I couldn't ignore the strange feeling creeping up my spine. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone or anything. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and the silence pressed in on me from all sides. I decided to head back to the cabin. As I turned around, something caught my eye, an odd shape in the distance. It wasn't far from the cabin, just past a cluster of trees. I couldn't make out what it was, but it seemed out of place, as though it didn't belong there. My curiosity got the better of me, so I started walking toward it. The closer I got, the more uneasy I became. It was a small, weathered shack, barely visible through the thick trees. There was something about it that felt off. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the air around it was thicker, charged with a kind of heaviness. The shack itself looked abandoned. Its walls were falling apart, and the roof was caved in on one side. It was a miracle it was still standing at all. I stood there for a few moments, staring at it. Something in my gut told me to leave, to turn around and go back to the cabin. But my feet refused to move. Something was pulling me toward it, some deep instinct that I couldn't ignore. I finally stepped closer, careful to avoid stepping on any loose boards or fallen branches. The door of the shack was hanging off one hinge, barely attached to the frame. Inside, I could see remnants of old furniture. A chair, a table, and something that looked like a mattress on the floor. There were no windows, and the inside of the shack was pitch black, even though the sun was still setting. I wanted to leave. I really did, but I couldn't. I stepped inside. My breath echoed in the empty space as I took in the decaying surroundings. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe. There was an odd smell in the air too. Something metallic, like blood, but stale and old. As I moved further in, my foot kicked something hard. I bent down and found a rusted metal box, half buried in the dirt. My heart started to race. I reached down and opened it, expecting to find old, worthless trinkets. Instead, there was a thick, worn notebook inside. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong with the other junk in the box. I pulled it out and flipped it open. The first few pages were filled with neat, almost obsessive writing. Notes, dates, names, and places that I didn't recognize. But as I flipped through it, something began to stand out. The entries became more erratic, the handwriting shaky and hurried. The last entry made my stomach churn. _ I can hear them outside now. They know I'm here. I can feel them watching. It's only a matter of time before they come inside. _ I slammed the book shut and jumped back, my heart racing in my chest. I hadn't noticed it before, but the temperature in the shack had dropped significantly. The air felt colder, almost biting. I took one last look at the shack and bolted out the door. As I ran back to the cabin, I could have sworn I heard something. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, following me. By the time I made it back to the cabin, I was shaking. I locked the door behind me and threw the bolt across. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but I knew I didn't want to be anywhere near that shack. The rest of the night was a blur of pacing and anxiety. The silence around the cabin seemed even more oppressive, like it was closing in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I lay down in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. The only sound in the cabin was the occasional creak of the wooden walls as the house settled. But then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard something outside, a faint scraping sound, like something or someone was moving around the cabin. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I forced myself to stay calm, to reason with myself. It was probably just an animal, a raccoon or something small. But then the scraping sound stopped, and I heard something else. A low, guttural noise, almost like breathing, but slow and uneven. It was coming from just outside my window. I slowly got out of bed, my body trembling. The curtains were still drawn, but I had to know. I slowly moved toward the window and peered through a small gap between the curtains. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was something standing just outside the cabin. It wasn't human, at least not in the way I understood it. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far. Its skin was pale and thin, like it had been stretched too tight over a skeleton. Its eyes, black and hollow, were staring directly at me through the window. For a long moment, neither of us moved. And then, slowly, it lifted its hand. The fingers were long, unnaturally long, and they tapped against the glass. 3 sharp taps. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. I felt paralyzed, like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. But then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the thing turned and vanished into the woods, leaving only the deep silence behind. I waited for hours before I dared to move again. But when I finally opened the door and stepped outside, the world was still and calm. No sign of the creature, no footsteps, no sounds. Just the same oppressive quiet I had felt when I first arrived. The next day, I packed my things and left. I didn't stop to take anything with me, not even the strange notebook. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't want to. All I knew was that whatever was out there in those woods, I didn't want to find it again. When I left, the world felt normal again. The silence was still there, but it wasn't oppressive. It was just quiet, and I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. I wasn't sure if what I had seen was real or if it was some sort of hallucination, but I wasn't going to stay to find out. I never went back to that cabin, and I never looked up the name on the notebook or the strange, twisted entries inside it. Some things are better left forgotten. I remember that day clearly. The road ahead of me stretched into a blur of heat and dust, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I had taken a detour from my usual route, just to clear my head. Nothing unusual at first, just a few hours of driving through the middle of nowhere. The engine of my old car hummed steadily, and the air smelled of dry earth. My phone had lost service miles ago, and with each passing mile, it felt like I was sinking deeper into a void. There were no other cars, no signs of civilization, just barren fields and long stretches of gravel road. I thought I'd take a scenic route, but now I was beginning to wonder if it had been a mistake. The road was narrow, winding in strange angles, and I couldn't remember the last time I had passed another person. My only companions were the occasional crows perched on the dead trees that lined the edge of the road, their black eyes seeming to follow my every move. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but a nagging unease settled in my chest, pulling at me like a weight I couldn't shake. Around midday, the heat started to get unbearable. My car's air conditioner sputtered and died hours ago. Sweat rolled down my back as I wiped my forehead with the back of my hand. I had no choice but to keep going, though. Turning around seemed like too much of a hassle. Besides, how much further could it be? A sign finally appeared, rusted and half hidden by the overgrowth. It read Warren's Hollow, 10 miles. The name did nothing to calm my nerves. In fact, it made me more uneasy. I couldn't place it, but there was something strange about that name, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I passed a dilapidated barn, its wooden planks sagging under years of neglect. The trees here seemed to grow in twisted, unnatural patterns, their branches reaching out like long, gnarled fingers. The air felt thick, as though the very atmosphere itself was weighing me down. As I turned another bend, I saw something up ahead. At first, it seemed like a mirage, an illusion created by the heat. But as I got closer, the image became clearer. A small, run-down gas station sat on the side of the road. It looked like it hadn't been in business for years. The paint was peeling from the walls, and the pump was rusted, the nozzle hanging limply like it hadn't been touched in decades. I pulled in, needing to stretch my legs and grab some water. It was the first sign of civilization I had seen in what felt like forever. The building was silent, almost too silent, as though it hadn't heard the sound of human footsteps in ages. A small, rickety door led into the station's office, and I pushed it open with a creak that echoed in the stillness. Inside, the air smelled stale and musty. The shelves were lined with dusty, expired snacks and old newspapers. There were no signs of life, no cashier, no customers. Just empty space and the faint hum of an old refrigerator in the back. I walked around, unsure of what to do. There was a counter with a register, but it looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. My footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor as I made my way to the back, hoping to find a bathroom or maybe some bottled water. That's when I noticed something strange. On one of the shelves, behind a stack of old magazines, was a small, weathered book. It was a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Something about it drew me in. I hesitated for a moment before reaching out to grab it. The moment my fingers touched the cover, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was an odd sensation, like the book wasn't just a book, like it was waiting for me to find it. I opened the journal, and the first page was filled with what seemed to be hastily scribbled notes. The handwriting was barely legible, but the words stood out against the fading ink. They never leave. No one ever leaves, I frowned and turned the page. It was more of the same. Fragmented sentences, disjointed thoughts, as though the writer had been desperately trying to get something off their chest. A chill ran through me as I read on. It's in the land, the earth here. It doesn't let go. The pages became more erratic, as though the writer was growing increasingly agitated. My heart began to race. I flipped through the book quickly now, scanning the pages in search of something more, but everything seemed to blur together. Words about the land, about people disappearing, about something watching. I couldn't make sense of it, but I felt my skin prickling with an unease that I couldn't explain. I didn't want to stay there any longer. The atmosphere of the gas station was starting to feel oppressive, like something was watching me from the corners of the room. I stuffed the journal into my backpack, not sure why I felt compelled to take it with me, but I did. Without thinking, I left the gas station and headed back to my car. As I drove away, the feeling of being followed crept over me, settling in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me from behind, from the edges of the trees, from the long stretch of empty road. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, and I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. It was then that I saw it, a figure in the distance standing on the side of the road. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He was holding something in his hands, but I couldn't tell what it was. I should have driven past. I should have kept going. But for some reason, I didn't. I stopped the car a few feet away from him, my engine idling. The man didn't move. I honked the horn, but he didn't react. I felt my pulse quicken, and I was just about to roll the window down and ask if he needed help when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was something off about the way he stood. It was as if he wasn't fully there, like his figure was fading in and out of focus, flickering like a bad TV signal. My hand shot to the door handle, ready to speed off, but before I could move, the man turned his head slowly. Very slowly. I couldn't see his face. It was covered by the shadow of his hat, but something about his movement was unnatural, like it wasn't human. I floored the gas pedal without thinking. The car shot forward, and I didn't look back until I reached the main road, miles down the way. The rest of the drive was a blur, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just seen. But soon, I reached a sign for a town called Warren's Hollow, the very place I'd seen on the sign earlier. The feeling of unease was still gnawing at me, but I was too tired to keep going. I decided to stop for the night. The town was small, barely more than a handful of buildings. A motel sat on the corner, its neon lights flickering weakly. I parked the car, grabbed my backpack, and made my way inside. The lobby smelled of old carpet and stale coffee. The receptionist, an elderly woman with frail hands, smiled at me as I approached. Her eyes were dull, but she greeted me with a friendly enough tone, giving me the key to a room without a word. It wasn't until I stepped into the room that I felt the weight of the silence settle around me. It wasn't a loud silence. It wasn't a ghostly silence. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the world outside had just stopped. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind still reeling from the events of the day. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt like I was being drawn into something far bigger than I could comprehend. I pulled out the journal from my backpack and started flipping through it again. As I reached the final pages, one line stood out to me, clearer than the rest. The land calls to you. It won't let you go. You can't leave once you're here. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The walls of the room seemed to close in around me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was in the room with me, something that had been there all along. It wasn't until the next morning that I understood. I left the motel, hoping to get out of town as quickly as possible. But as I drove out, I realized something horrifying. The road I had driven in on, the road that had led me to Warren's Hollow, was gone. The familiar landmarks, the signs, the gas station, everything was gone. All that remained was an empty stretch of road leading further into the wilderness. I was trapped. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me and the quiet of the woods, away from the noise of the city. The cabin I rented was tucked deep in a forested area, miles from the nearest town. No cell signal, no distractions, just the sound of nature and time to relax. I thought it would be perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun still high but beginning to dip behind the trees. The cabin looked older than the photos had shown. It was small, one-story, with a sloping roof and thick, wooden beams that groaned in the wind. The porch had a swing, but the paint was chipped and faded. It was more rustic than I'd imagined, but that was okay. It added to the charm. I unpacked my things quickly. The place was musty inside, the air heavy with the smell of old wood and dust. The windows were covered with thick curtains that I pushed aside, revealing the overgrown forest just outside. I felt a strange sense of calm mixed with something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The first night was uneventful. I spent most of it reading and drinking wine in front of the fireplace. The crackling of the wood was comforting. I didn't even realize how tired I was until my eyelids grew heavy. I set down the book, blew out the candle on the table, and turned in for the night. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, but there was something about the silence that kept me awake longer than I expected. The usual sounds of wildlife outside, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, seemed distant. Everything felt strangely still, too still. It was the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every little creak and groan in the house. At some point in the night, I heard something, a soft, tapping sound. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the window, but then it grew louder. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal either. The sound was deliberate, slow, like someone was gently tapping on the glass. My heart rate quickened. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to get up and look outside. Maybe it was just a branch, I told myself. But the tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, as though it was waiting for something. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and pointed it toward the window. The beam of light cut through the dark, but I saw nothing outside. The forest was as still as it had been before. No movement, no shadows. I waited for the tapping to stop. It did, but that didn't put me at ease. The longer I lay there, the more I realized how unnervingly quiet it had become. Not even the wind stirred the trees. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was nothing. I turned over, pulling the covers tightly around me, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I went out for a walk to clear my head. The forest was peaceful in the daylight, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves slowly bringing me back to my senses. I explored a little beyond the cabin, taking in the sights of moss-covered trees and the occasional deer tracks. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue. It felt like the world was miles away from anything familiar, which was exactly what I wanted. That evening, I decided to cook dinner in the small kitchen of the cabin. There was a sense of calm now, and I was looking forward to settling in for the night. As I chopped vegetables, I thought about the tapping noise from the night before. I convinced myself it had just been an odd branch hitting the window, nothing more. But then the lights flickered. I froze, knife still in hand. I turned to the overhead light, but it flickered again and then went out completely. I stood there in the dark for a moment, unsure of what to do. The house was so quiet again, except for the soft hum of the fridge in the corner. I walked to the fuse box, checked the circuit breakers, but everything seemed normal. I tried the light again, but it stayed off. Frustrated, I grabbed a few candles from a nearby shelf and lit them. The soft glow from the flames filled the cabin with a strange warmth, but the air still felt off. I shook the feeling away and finished making dinner by candlelight. After eating, I decided to take a walk around the perimeter of the cabin. I wanted to check the windows, maybe look for any signs of branches hitting the glass, anything that might explain the noises I'd heard. The sky was nearly dark now, and the trees surrounding the cabin cast long shadows across the yard. I circled the cabin twice, inspecting every window, every corner of the porch, but there was nothing. No branches brushing against the walls, no strange marks on the windows. Everything looked normal. The forest stretched out beyond, dark and silent. As I walked back to the front door, I noticed something strange. The swing on the porch was gently rocking back and forth. I hadn't touched it, and the wind wasn't strong enough to make it move. It was as if someone had just gotten off it and walked away. But the swing had been completely still when I walked around the house just moments earlier. I stood there, staring at it for a long time. I couldn't explain it. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical reason for everything that had been happening. But there was no answer, only the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. That night, the tapping started again. I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed, listening, waiting. The sound began softly at first, just like before, but this time it didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic. Top, top, top. Over and over again, like something or someone was trying to get in. My pulse was racing. I grabbed the flashlight, but I didn't want to go to the window again. What if something was out there? I couldn't bring myself to look. I pulled the covers up to my chin and stared at the dark room, listening to the tapping that wouldn't stop. It went on for what felt like hours. Eventually, the sound stopped. There was nothing, just the stillness of the night. I had enough. The next morning, I packed my things, not bothering to eat breakfast. I couldn't stay another night in that cabin. The tapping, the eerie silence, it was too much. I left the keys on the counter and locked the door behind me, stepping out into the cool morning air. As I drove away from the cabin, I felt a strange sense of relief. The tension in my chest finally began to loosen. But as I drove farther down the narrow dirt road, I glanced in my rearview mirror, and for just a second, I could have sworn I saw the porch swing moving again. I didn't stop. When I finally made it to the nearest town, I stopped at the small diner to get some coffee. As I sat down at the counter, I couldn't help but overhear the conversation between the waitress and an older man sitting nearby. He was talking about the cabin I had rented. "I wouldn't go up there alone," he said, his voice low. "That place has a history. People say it's been abandoned for years, but sometimes people still go up there." I listened, my heart pounding in my chest. The waitress nodded, but I didn't catch the rest of the conversation. All I could think about was the cabin and the strange feeling I had left behind. When I finally asked the waitress about it, she just shook her head. "It's a place that's been around for a long time. People come and go, but no one ever stays long. There's a reason for that." I paid for my coffee and left the diner, the unease creeping back into my thoughts. But for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't expect it to go this way. No one could have, really. The cabin had seemed like the perfect getaway at first. Quiet, remote, and nestled deep in the woods. I'd been wanting a break for so long, just a few days away from the city, from the constant noise, the people, the clutter, a place to clear my head, breathe, and relax. I found the place online. The listing looked good. An isolated cabin, no neighbors, miles from the nearest road. Just the kind of solitude I needed. I thought it would be easy. Just pack a bag, rent the place, and head out. Simple. But the second I arrived, things started to feel off. The cabin itself was small, built from dark wood, its edges weathered and rough, giving off an old-world charm. It sat near the edge of a dense forest. The trees, tall and ancient, lined the property, their branches heavy with the weight of winter. The whole area was eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt it, the silence. It was so thick, like the air was holding its breath, and the ground felt unnaturally still beneath my feet. I shook it off, though. What else could I do? I was already there. It wasn't like I could just turn around and leave. The interior of the cabin was exactly what I expected. Cozy but bare. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a sofa and a fireplace, and a bedroom with a big bed covered in an old quilt. It smelled musty, like dust and forgotten memories, but not in a bad way. It had character. The kind of character that made you feel like you were stepping into something that had been there far longer than you had. I unpacked quickly, trying to ignore the strange sense of unease settling in my chest. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the isolation. I'd never spent this much time alone before, not in a place like this. Sure, I'd been on camping trips and stayed at cabins before, but this one felt different. The first night went by uneventfully. I ate a simple dinner, read a little, and went to bed. The bed creaked under me, but I still managed to fall asleep despite the odd noises coming from outside. The wind, the cracking of branches, the occasional screech of some animal in the distance. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? I woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through the windows, and for a brief moment, I felt calm again. It was going to be a peaceful retreat, I told myself. Just a few days to reset. But as I ventured outside to stretch my legs, something made me pause. A strange marking on the cabin's front door. At first, I thought it was a smudge, maybe dirt or something left by the wind. But when I looked closer, I realized it was a symbol. A crude drawing, scratched into the wood, almost like someone had carved it there recently. It was a circle with jagged lines coming off it, like lightning bolts or something more abstract. My heart raced for a second, but I pushed the thought out of my mind. It's probably nothing, I whispered to myself. Maybe it's just old. I tried to move past it. I spent the day hiking around the area, exploring the forest, and taking photos of the landscape. The silence was suffocating, though. Not the peaceful kind of silence you get in nature, but a heavy, watchful kind of silence, as if the woods were waiting for something. Every now and then, I'd feel like I was being watched, like eyes were on me from the trees, though when I looked, nothing was there. That night, I sat by the fire, just staring into the flames, thinking about how weirdly tense I'd felt all day. It was like I wasn't alone. I heard things that didn't make sense. Faint rustling noises, branches snapping just outside the cabin. Nothing too loud, but it was enough to keep me on edge. I didn't sleep well that night. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as if I'd been running. But each time I looked around the room, the shadows seemed normal. The cabin was still. No signs of anything unusual. I told myself it was just the nerves, the quiet, getting to me. By the third day, the unease had deepened. Every time I stepped outside, the woods felt closer, like they were encroaching on the cabin. The trees felt too thick, their limbs too twisted. I felt like I couldn't escape them, no matter which direction I walked in. Then, as I ventured deeper into the woods, I found something. A trail, not a hiking trail, not something that seemed man-made or regularly used. It was faint, hidden beneath the fallen leaves, barely visible unless you were really looking for it. My curiosity got the better of me and I followed it. The trail wound deeper into the forest, growing darker as the trees thickened around me. The air felt heavier here, the silence even more pronounced. I could barely hear anything but my own breathing and the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. It wasn't until I stumbled upon a clearing that I realized how far I'd gone. In the middle of the clearing was an old structure. It looked like an abandoned shed or a small cabin, but it was barely standing. Its roof had caved in, and the walls were covered in moss and vines. A feeling of dread washed over me. I should have turned back, but instead I walked closer. The door was ajar, and when I pushed it open, the smell hit me. Damp, moldy, decayed. The inside was empty, save for a few rusted tools scattered on the ground. But then, on the far wall, something caught my eye. More symbols, the same kind I'd seen on the cabin door. Crude, jagged markings etched into the wood, almost like they were trying to communicate something. I backed away, my pulse racing, my hands shaking. I wasn't sure what I had stumbled into, but I didn't want to find out. The walk back to the cabin felt longer. The trees seemed to press in on me, their branches reaching out like claws, the ground beneath me uneven and treacherous. When I finally made it back, I locked the door behind me, and for the first time since I arrived, I didn't feel safe. That night, I stayed up late, my eyes flicking between the dark corners of the room and the window, expecting to see something, someone, watching me. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence, the weight of the woods pressing in on the cabin. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't supposed to be here. By the fourth day, I knew I had to leave. The cabin felt wrong. The woods felt wrong. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, I knew something was off. The unease in my chest had shifted into something darker, something more primal. Fear. I packed my bags, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. But before I left, I stood there for a moment, staring at the strange symbol on the door again. The feeling in the pit of my stomach twisted. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I was starting to believe that it wasn't just some random marking. Just as I was about to leave, I heard it, a noise from outside, faint rustling. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it sounded different. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, listening. It was coming closer, a slow shuffle of footsteps, soft but unmistakable. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I cracked the door open, just a sliver, peeking through. There was nothing there, just the trees, the shadows. But then I saw something else, a figure, standing in the distance, partially hidden by the trees. Tall, thin, unmoving, watching. I slammed the door shut, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't stay here, not anymore. I ran to the car. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the bags I left behind or the cabin that had once seemed so inviting. The only thing that mattered was getting away. The drive back felt endless, my mind racing. Was I being followed? Was I imagining things? What was that figure? I didn't stop until I was back in the city, safe. But every time I close my eyes, I see it again, the figure standing between the trees, waiting. It was supposed to be a simple hike, a weekend getaway to clear my mind and get away from the noise of daily life. I'd been planning this for weeks, picking a trail in the mountains that looked easy enough for someone like me who wasn't exactly an experienced hiker, but still wanted to feel that rush of nature, the quiet and peace of being far away from the world. I had a backpack with water, snacks, and a few layers of clothing in case the weather turned. My phone was in my pocket, though I didn't expect to need it much, and I made sure my shoes were sturdy enough to handle a variety of terrain. The trail I chose was a well-known one. The map said it was only about 5 miles, mostly through forested areas, with a gentle ascent up the mountain to a clearing with a view. I thought it'd be a perfect way to spend the afternoon. The weather was perfect that day. Clear skies, the sun warming my back, and just enough of a breeze to keep things from getting too hot. I started at the trailhead just as the first few hikers were leaving, which I figured was a good sign. The trail didn't feel too crowded, but there were enough people around that I knew I wasn't alone. The path was well maintained at first, wide and easy to follow. Tall trees lined either side, their branches thick with leaves, creating a kind of canopy that shielded me from the sun. The air smelled fresh and earthy, the kind of smell that made you feel alive and grounded. Birds were chirping above me, and occasionally, I'd hear the rustle of leaves as small animals moved through the underbrush. As I walked, I kept thinking about how simple this all was. Just walking in the woods, taking in the sights and sounds, away from the stress and noise. Everything felt fine. I was on my own, and that thought made me feel free, like I could take my time, breathe, and just be. I wasn't rushing, just enjoying the scenery. The trail was winding a bit now, the path narrowing in places, but still nothing too difficult. After about an hour, I came across a section where the trees thinned out, revealing a small creek to the left. The sound of the water rushing over rocks was peaceful, and I stopped for a moment to take a drink of water from my bottle and listen to the creek's natural rhythm. That's when I first felt it. A chill not from the weather, but from something else. It was as if someone was watching me, though I could see nothing unusual. I shook it off, trying to convince myself it was just the isolation of the woods making me feel that way. Maybe it was just the quiet. Maybe my mind was playing tricks. But as I stood by the creek for a few minutes, stretching my legs and looking around, the feeling wouldn't go away. I continued on, but the unease lingered, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I usually would. The trail seemed less populated now, and the air around me had grown stiller, almost too still. The sunlight filtering through the trees was dimmer, the shadows growing longer as I climbed higher into the hills. Around a bend, I came across a clearing where the path split into 2 directions. One trail seemed to continue along the mountain ridge, while the other veered off into a dense thicket of trees. I paused, unsure of which way to go. Both trails were marked, but one seemed less worn, less traveled. It looked like it would take me deeper into the forest, and instinct told me to avoid it. I figured I'd stay on the more traveled path, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that I should have taken the other trail. But I pressed on. The further I walked, the more quiet it became. The chirping of birds, which had filled the air when I started, grew sporadic. The rustling of the leaves and branches above me stopped altogether. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then came the sound, a faint, low thud in the distance, like something heavy had fallen to the ground or someone had kicked a rock. It was distant, but it wasn't the wind. I couldn't explain it. My heart began to race, and I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was a falling tree branch. Maybe it was an animal, something large, moving through the forest. Still, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. A few minutes later, I came upon another fork in the trail. This one was even less distinct. The markings were faded, the signposts half buried under leaves. I stood there, trying to decide if I should turn around and head back to the first fork. But then I saw it, just for a second, a shadow moving between the trees. It was fast, and it was gone in an instant, but it was enough to make my stomach turn. I took the path that seemed more traveled, though it felt wrong now. The trees were closer, the air heavier. I couldn't tell if the sky was overcast or if the thick branches above were just blocking out the sunlight. The path narrowed further as I continued, and the ground under my feet started to slope downward. At the bottom of the hill, the trail opened up into a small valley, the sort of place that might have been beautiful if I wasn't so on edge. That's when I saw it. A cabin. A small, weather-beaten structure tucked back in the trees, barely noticeable unless you were right on top of it. It was old, the wood darkened by age, with a roof that looked like it might collapse any second. There were no windows, only a single door, and the door was slightly ajar. I stopped in my tracks, feeling that same prickling sensation crawl up my spine. Who would build a cabin all the way out here? And why hadn't I heard about it in any of the trail descriptions? No one had mentioned anything about a cabin. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to decide what to do. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but something, curiosity maybe, pulled me closer. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I could take a quick look and move on. There was no harm in that, right? I walked toward the cabin, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I was close enough, I paused again. The door creaked slightly in the wind, though there was no breeze. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I reached for the handle. That's when I heard it. A voice, not clear, but unmistakable. A sound like a whisper, just out of reach of understanding. It didn't come from inside the cabin, but from somewhere deeper in the woods. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. Could have been another hiker, though I hadn't seen anyone in a while. Could have been the wind, though it was strangely still. I couldn't stay there, not now. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and the whispers, they weren't just my imagination. They were real. Slowly, I turned around, the dread in my chest turning into a solid lump of fear. Without thinking, I started back toward the path, faster this time, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks. I didn't dare look behind me as I hurried down the trail. My mind was racing, but all I could think about was the whispers. They weren't in my head. They weren't a trick of the wind. They were real, and they were getting closer. But when I finally reached the trailhead, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, as if the air itself had changed. The sunlight felt warm again, and the birds had returned to their calls. It was only when I reached my car and locked the doors that I dared to breathe. I had never been so relieved to be back in civilization. I've always preferred solitude, There's something about being away from people, surrounded only by nature and your thoughts, that feels right. I grew up in a small town, and even though I moved to the city a few years ago for work, I always found a way to return to the familiar silence of the woods whenever I could. Something about it calms me, makes me feel at peace in a way nothing else can. So, when I had a few days off, I decided to take a solo trip into the woods again. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat. Just me, my backpack, and the untouched wilderness. No phone signal, no distractions. I've done this countless times before without issue, but this time, things felt different from the moment I stepped off the trail and into the woods. I parked my car at the base of the mountain, where the road turns into a narrow dirt path. The sun had just begun to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I checked my bag again, making sure I had everything I might need: a tent, sleeping bag, water, food, a map, a flashlight, and extra batteries. The essentials. The air smelled fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and I started walking deeper into the forest. The trail wasn't difficult, but it was steep in some places, and as the sun dipped lower, the shadows grew long and stretched across the ground like dark fingers. I wasn't worried, this was my element. I was used to it. I walked for hours, enjoying the quiet, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional bird call. I had a general sense of where I was going, a small clearing about 5 miles in that I loved camping at. But as the light began to fade, I started to realize something strange. The air had grown colder, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, almost as if the entire place had quieted down for some reason. Even the wind, which usually rustled through the branches, was eerily still. I checked my watch, it was getting late. I knew I wasn't far from the clearing, but something about the atmosphere felt off. I quickened my pace, but the stillness seemed to follow me. The further I went, the more uncomfortable I became. The woods felt too empty. Finally, I reached the clearing. It was a small, flat area with a ring of trees surrounding it, and it always felt safe, like it was a place where the outside world couldn't reach me. I set up my tent quickly, barely noticing the cold or the quiet anymore. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and darkness had settled in completely. I lit my lantern, then sat outside for a while, staring into the flickering flame. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a distant rustling in the trees. I thought it was just the wind picking up, so I ignored it. But the rustling didn't stop. It got louder, like something was moving through the woods, heading in my direction. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The sound was unmistakable now. Something was walking through the underbrush, twigs snapping underfoot. I stood up, my pulse quickening. The woods were supposed to be empty. No one came out here this deep into the wilderness, especially not at night. I was sure of that. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound, the beam cutting through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but trees, their tall, dark shapes looming in the distance. The sound of footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was just imagining things. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, a person, or at least it looked like one, emerged from the trees. It was tall, thin, and oddly shaped, almost as if it wasn't fully standing upright. I couldn't make out any details at first, just the silhouette of someone moving slowly toward me. The flashlight's beam bounced off the figure's form, but it didn't seem to illuminate it fully. It was as though the light couldn't reach it, or it absorbed the light instead. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Should I call out? But there was something strange about the way it moved, unnatural, stiff, like it was dragging its legs behind it. And the way it was slowly approaching, it wasn't like someone walking toward me. It was deliberate, methodical, like it had all the time in the world. I felt a chill run down my spine. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, crept into my mind. The figure didn't speak, didn't make any noise except for the sound of its footsteps. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. My mind raced. It was too far to run, and I wasn't about to make the first move toward it. I had no idea what it was or what it wanted, but there was a gut feeling telling me not to approach. I backed up slowly, then turned and bolted toward my tent. My breath was sharp, ragged in my chest as I scrambled to get inside, fumbling with the zipper as my hands shook uncontrollably. Finally, I managed to get it shut. I collapsed against the side of the tent, heart racing, every muscle tense. Outside, the figure didn't follow immediately. I listened, trying to hear any sounds, footsteps, breathing, but it was silent, too silent. The only sound was the rush of blood in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe longer, and eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed my flashlight again, but as I unzipped the tent and poked my head out, I found nothing. The clearing was empty. I waited. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. There was no way that figure had just disappeared. Then I saw it again. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just inside the trees. But this time I could see it clearly. It was a man, at least it looked like a man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, but there was something deeply wrong about him. His face was pale, almost gray, with hollow, empty eyes that stared straight at me. His expression was blank, emotionless, as if he wasn't aware of me, but at the same time, he was staring directly at me. I froze again, unable to move, unsure if I should scream or run. I thought about reaching for my phone, but I realized it wasn't in my bag. My heart hammered, my breath shallow and fast. I couldn't look away, couldn't stop staring into those dark, empty eyes. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the figure turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't know why, but I felt a strange urge to follow him. A sick curiosity clawed at me, urging me to leave the safety of my tent and venture into the dark forest after him. But I didn't. I stayed put, frozen in place. When morning finally came, the figure was gone. The woods were empty again, just as they should have been. The sun rose over the treetops, casting long shadows across the clearing. I packed up my things quickly, not bothering to enjoy the usual calm of the morning. I didn't feel safe anymore, and I couldn't shake the image of those hollow eyes. I made my way back down the trail, trying to ignore the strange feeling of being followed, of something watching me just out of sight. It wasn't until I reached my car and started driving back toward the town that I felt like I could breathe again. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I swear I saw something move in the woods behind me. I never went back to that place. Maybe I'll never understand what happened, but I don't need to. Some things are better left unexplained. All I know is that the woods aren't as peaceful as they seem, and sometimes there are things out there that don't belong. The sun had long since set, leaving only the distant glow of streetlights behind me. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like hours. The highway stretched endlessly, an empty, dark ribbon winding through fields and woods. I was alone, with no service on my phone, and a sense of isolation that seemed to close in with every mile I drove. It had been a long day, and I was just trying to get home. My GPS had started acting up, and I had made the mistake of taking a detour, hoping to avoid the heavy traffic on the main roads. What had started as a shortcut soon turned into a long, winding path through nowhere. I didn't even know the name of the town I was heading toward anymore, just that it was supposed to be a small place with a motel. The motel was the only reason I was still going. I had no other options. The darkened landscape around me was unsettling. A thick fog had started to roll in, seeping in through the trees on either side of the road. The headlights of my car barely made a dent in the thick mist. I tried to keep calm, but something in the air felt off, something I couldn't explain. The road, now barely more than a narrow strip, twisted and turned like a snake, and the occasional pothole made my car jolt, waking me from my daydreaming. I glanced at the clock, 3:42 a.m. I had to stop. My eyes were heavy, and I could feel the weight of fatigue setting in. There were no towns around, no signs of life, just trees and darkness. But I knew I couldn't keep going. My mind felt foggy, and the last thing I wanted was to drive off the road because I'd nodded off. I spotted a small dirt shoulder a few yards ahead. It was a risk, no telling what could be lurking out there, but it was better than pushing my luck. I slowed down, turned off the road, and parked the car. The engine died with a soft hum, and the world around me fell completely silent. The fog was thicker now, pressing in like an unseen weight. I couldn't see much more than the outline of the trees surrounding me. My headlights illuminated a small patch of dirt and weeds, but beyond that, nothing. I reclined my seat, trying to get comfortable. The thought of sleep felt like a luxury. My eyes fluttered shut, and for a moment, I almost drifted off. But then I heard it. Footsteps, faint but distinct, crunching on the gravel just outside my window. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there. I sat up straight, my senses on high alert. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the footsteps didn't come closer. They just stopped. Maybe it was a deer, I told myself, trying to rationalize the sound. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That was no deer. I waited, trying to steady my breathing. The sound didn't return, but the unease didn't leave me. I turned the engine back on, ready to pull away if anything felt off. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The fog had thickened, and the headlights only lit up a small distance behind me. Everything looked still. I debated whether to stay put or leave. There was no one else on this road. I was in the middle of nowhere. There was no reason to feel like I wasn't alone, right? Just then, I heard it again. A faint scraping sound, like something dragging along the dirt, came from behind the car at the back, near the trunk. My heart thudded in my chest. I gripped the wheel, my hands sweaty. There was no way it was an animal this time. Something or someone was out there. Slowly, I turned the ignition key, easing the car forward, ready to peel away if I had to. But then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, there was a figure standing just outside the reach of my headlights, barely visible through the thick fog. The shape of a person standing completely still. Panic shot through me. Who would be out here at this hour? And why were they just standing there? I thought about the nearest town. It was at least 30 miles away, and I had no idea if there was anyone around. I considered calling for help, but my phone was dead, and there was no signal. I couldn't stay here, not with that person so close. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. I didn't even look back. My eyes were locked on the road ahead, hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. The fog seemed to close in on me even more as I drove faster, my headlights barely cutting through the haze. Every turn in the road felt like it could be the one where something was waiting. Every tree, every shadow became a potential threat. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling didn't go away. It clung to me, a cold presence that I couldn't shake. I must have driven for another 10 minutes, my car speeding along the empty road, the faintest sound of tires on gravel the only thing I could hear. Then I saw it, lights. Real lights, not just the dim glow of my headlights. A cluster of lights appeared through the mist, flickering through the trees. It was a small building, maybe a cabin or a diner. I didn't care what it was. I needed somewhere safe. I pulled into the parking lot, heart still racing. The fog was so thick I could barely see the outline of the building in front of me, but the lights inside were bright. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, just listening. The car was silent, the world around me muffled in the thick fog. I stepped out, hesitating before walking toward the entrance. The door was ajar, and the quiet inside made it feel abandoned. But then I saw someone standing behind the counter. A man with dark, tired eyes and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded when he saw me. "You lost?" he asked, his voice raspy from the smoke. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, just needed a place to stop for the night." "You're lucky," he muttered. "We don't get many travelers this far out." He gave me a strange look, like he was trying to figure me out. "What's your name?" I hesitated, but answered, "Anna." He didn't reply right away, just took a long drag from his cigarette and stared out the window. "You should be careful around here," he finally said, flicking the ash into a tray. "It's a strange place. People come and go, but you never really know what's out there." I blinked, unsure if he was being cryptic or if I had missed something. He shook his head as if clearing a thought. "Sorry, long night. Just stay inside tonight. Don't wander off." The warning wasn't lost on me, but I didn't have the energy to press him further. I asked for a room, paid, and made my way down the hall. The motel room was small but clean, the kind of place where time felt frozen, stuck in the past. The bed creaked when I lay down, but I didn't care. I needed sleep more than anything. I thought about the figure in the fog, the strange feeling that had followed me. I thought about the man behind the counter and his odd warning. But exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a dreamless sleep, the fog outside pressing in against the windows. Morning came, bright and cold, and when I opened my eyes, the world felt different. The fog had lifted, and sunlight streamed in through the small window. But something was wrong. The man behind the counter was gone. The motel was completely still, quiet. As I packed my things, I glanced at the window, noticing a shape on the horizon. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a figure, standing still in the distance. I left quickly, heart still pounding from the strange events of the night before. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There was nothing in the fog anymore. No figure, no strange shapes, just the road ahead. But the feeling didn't leave me. I didn't stop at that motel again. Couldn't. The memory of that night, the figure in the fog, the man's warning, it all stayed with me. Some places, some roads are better left unexplored. And sometimes the scariest part is not what you see, but what you can't explain.